I was meant to start by saying good morning, but happily with those church bells we now say good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'll say a little bit more about my interest in Poland in a slide in a few minutes. But I especially want to thank both Stephen here and Leszek there, who, as we say in English, went the further kilometre, the further mile, in any case, and gave a huge amount of help getting me here. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Those of you who pay attention to titles, and I hope you don't, I'm not referring to my forthcoming lordship, of course, no, a bit different, is that the title on the screen is slightly different from the one in front of you, but do not worry, it's exactly the same story. So, if this thing works, does it work? Mm-hmm. No? Oh, it just turned me on. It has a switch. Yeah. Very briefly, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm also Christian, not, as it happens, Catholic, but very sympathetic to that tradition. My last slide might explain that as well, in due course. So the points, by and large, to do with evolutionary biology are that they are almost completely open-ended and, if you like, indeterminate. In other words, there's no predictability to the process, and there's no sense that there's any sort of outcome. And the role of the dice might be applied to such matters as mutation, commonly enough, stray cosmic ray, or more particularly mass extinctions, whereby one radically redirects the courses of evolution. Now, I don't have time to talk about mass extinctions, but in point of fact, in another day, I could explain to you that far from being destructive, actually, paradoxically, they're highly creative. Planets without mass extinctions are in deep trouble, but that's a different story. So when we, I beg your pardon, when we go to talk about the open-endedness of evolution, the first stopping point for individuals interested in the popular view of science, and that's very important, would be people like Stephen Jay Gould. And I'm not going to read this out. I hope it's visible enough to at least those of you in the front. But the conceit of Gould was that famously, if we were to rerun the tape of life from a starting point, perhaps the Cambrian explosion 500,000 years ago, then the likelihood of anything like me, you, or a human being here, let alone addressing a meeting in Kraków, would be vanishingly remote and small. There'd be other forms of life, but humans themselves are as much an accidental product of evolution as a tulip or a giardia, or whatever your favorite organism might be. Well, in point of fact, I disagree with this on scientific grounds, although, as I hope to persuade you, it also has a theological dimension of some interest. And the reason for this is that we are invited to consider, in the way that Gould did, what is the nature of counterfactuals. Now, I don't imagine seeing a picture of this man in this country is going to win me any plaudits at all, and neither should it. But a whole series of historians have considered how, in the case of my country, if, for instance, Chamberlain had lived and wasn't so ill, or if Halifax had taken over the premiership rather than Churchill, then the likelihood is we would have almost certainly reached an accommodation with the Nazis. Here you are much less lucky, of course, but believe it or not, and knowing the majority of people here are Polish, I can assure you that some of us very much remember the contribution of the Polish pilots in the Battle of Britain, not to mention the many Polish regiments, one of whom, you probably know, adopted a bear on their campaign up the Italian peninsula. So these sorts of things invite all sorts of speculations, and one could, for instance, go back to Jerusalem, AD 33, and ask what would have happened if, and I don't really have to explain this story to you, do I, whether Pontius Pilate would have turned not to the crowd and said, right, he's yours, but actually goes to the prisoner Jesus and says fairly quietly, you're free, and then much more quietly, and the very best of luck. How would have history been different? Well, in point of fact, the essay in that collection of what-ifs is extremely ingenious and I think theologically completely sound. But in the way of materialist historicism, one would probably say that one wouldn't end up with Christianity. So I'm not making this in a facile sense at all, but the likelihood of most people's intellectual equipment is to invite the sense of chance rather than any sense of destiny. So why am I so suspicious that the thesis of Stephen Jay Gould and others, that is of open-ended contingency, might in fact be incorrect? Well, principally it's to do with the phenomena of what we call evolutionary convergence. And I'm going to give you two examples, one of which may not be completely familiar. And it is to do now, let me see if I can get that. There we are. It is to do with the consumption of alcohol. I'm particularly fond of this product here, 47%, not too much tonic, be careful about that. And also we compare how the inebriation or the drunkenness of humans compares with the drunkenness of fruit flies, Drosophila. And what we do is we have an extremely expensive piece of equipment, which in English is known as the inebriometer, which has many hundreds of fruit flies, which are suffused with this glorious ethanol fumes. And of course, the fruit flies become drunk pretty quickly. Now study their behavior. They start to move around. This is the speed they're moving on here. They rush around here. And maybe this evening at the dinner, we'll see similar behavior. Thereafter, in fact, there's a sort of cessation, and then they drop off their locomotion very quickly indeed. Everybody's looking for the next glass, or maybe the corkscrew, something like that. And thereafter, then they start to move more quickly, but note after about 10 minutes, they're not moving as fast, and in fact, it's plateaued. And this is a point in human drunkenness when we find our own jokes intensely funny. Thereafter, the fruit flies then go more and more slowly until at about 20 minutes, they die. The point here is that the trajectory of human inebriation is convergent on the trajectory of the fruit fly inebriation. And this has got nothing to do with the physiology or the biochemistry. It's a behavioral suite. A much better known example of convergence is that which I need hardly dwell on, and that is the convergence between the camera eye of the cephalopod, and those of you who are biologists will tell your companions that that's very closely related to the earthworm. And we ourselves, our own camera eye, which is convergently evolved, and we, of course, are very closely related to the starfish. So this construction of the camera eye is a very striking example of convergent evolution. Now, if this holds generally and would extend contra Gould to also the evolution of humans, thereby one would make a prediction that not only on this planet, but across the cosmos, there would be intelligences which would be remarkably similar to humans as we find them on this planet itself. And indeed, as you'll know, and it was mentioned in the previous talk with the James Webb Telescope and also the discovery of many extrasolar planets, there is a growing optimism that, in point of fact, contact with extraterrestrial civilizations is perhaps only a few weeks away, or maybe only a few years. It's thought now to be effectively inevitable. There is, however, a small problem, and that is referred to actually in an interesting way by David Brin, using almost a theological concept, the Great Silence. So far, absolutely nothing. Total silence. No signals, no evidence of visitation to this planet. We could look at the fossil record. So what on earth is going on? Well, the received area of debate circles around Enrico Fermi, who was an extremely distinguished Italian physicist, fled the Nazis from Italy, was a pioneer in the development of the atomic bomb and also the first fissionable reactor. And he said famously in a conversation with other people almost as clever as he was in Los Alamos in 1950, "Where are they? Why have we got no evidence of extraterrestrials?" And in point of fact, what's going to happen if we ever made contact with an extraterrestrial? Well, here's some potentially rather disappointing news. It may well be that life itself is full of all sorts of animals. And what are they doing? They are purring, hooting, shouting, and all the other noises and vocalizations which animals make. But they're not saying anything of the least interest, least of all to us. My own hunch, in point of fact, is even this is too optimistic. I suspect that Fermi was more or less correct, that we are alone, and that too potentially has some theological consequences. But be that as it may, in the last few years I've become increasingly interested, and I speak here as a world expert, the world expert on fossil worms, thereby I've moved direction into the study of animal behavior, not by doing my own research, but simply by looking at other people's publications. And as one might expect, so far as Darwinian continuity is concerned, our closeness to the great apes, I hope, is beyond dispute. I can't think of any line of evidence in science which would refute that. And thereby, as Darwin himself insisted, the intellectual capacity of the humans is only different in a matter of degree, but not in kind. And what I'm going to try and persuade you in the next 20 minutes is that this is long overdue for a radical reassessment. Partly what inspired my thinking was coming across a book in Vancouver, oddly enough, some years ago, by the Australian philosopher David Stove. And as I think you can read yourself at the top of the title, or the cover page of his book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, Selfish Dreams, Errors of Heredity, and Other Fables of Evolution. And briefly, what Stove was saying is that if you think you're going to persuade me as a philosopher that what's going on in the mind of this child is in any serious way connected in terms of morality and ethics and all sorts of other things with what we have in these cages behind us in terms of our immediate relatives, then to use a technical English phrase, you must be joking. Now, this I think can be encapsulated in this particular picture here, because in effect, the caption which should go with it is, what other species would think this is a sensible thing to do? We are utterly, utterly extraordinary, and we forget at our own peril how very, very unusual we are. We have become almost complacent in our uniqueness. And what happens is that when we then turn to look at the understanding of animal cognition and animal behavior, we actually are brought up quite quickly by some areas of unexamined, unremarked points of interest. To begin with, and this is impossible to avoid, although animal behaviorists will insist that they do their level best, is that we are hopelessly anthropomorphic. We cannot help but see the rest of the world through human eyes. And to actually imagine yourself, of course, as Thomas Nagel famously pointed out in his essay on the mind of the bat, how one can transfer oneself into another mind of another species is perhaps even arguably impossible. But I don't take this as an attitude of despair. What it actually tells me is that for the many, many years of experimentation and observation, a number of things have become clear, and it was alluded to briefly in the previous talk, that in many respects, and this is for a different conversation at a slightly different time, but science itself is in really deep trouble. We've had it referred to with regard to gender identity. It was also transparently clear in my country and perhaps here when we were told 4 years ago, with regards to the COVID, that we were going to follow the science and believe models which were simply fantastical. But there is a serious intellectual problem now with the way science is being pursued and the nature of its funding. That's actually not entirely unrelated to the study of animal behavior, for the simple reason that if you find something in another species which approximates to something which we identify as a human capacity, it will be published. If it doesn't, it almost certainly will never see the light of day. The negative evidence, which is also very important, is almost universally ignored. Be that as it may, what I'm going to now do is go very quickly through a number of examples to question the widespread wisdom that the difference is of degree rather than kind, as Darwin insisted. Now, in no way am I trying to say that I am looking down or condescending to the animals. The animals themselves, for what they do perfectly and superbly. And I'm not at all imagining that somehow they're inferior to us, except with regard to one crucial factor, or maybe two, which I'll refer to in just a moment. So, for example, you can teach dogs words in as much as well-trained animals, Chaser, Rico, Bailey, can identify names of toys. In the case of, I think, Chaser, more than 2,000 toys could be identified by name. So surely this animal has some concept of the name. Well, I can't unpack all experiments, but in point of fact, it turns out they don't. They can recognize the toy, but the transfer of actually understanding that this plastic object, which makes the most agreeable squeaking sound when it's in the jaws of the animal, actually has the name Arthur, is quite beyond their comprehension. And there's no reason why it should understand that. Correspondingly, another set of remarkable things, which I think in some way I could almost stop the talk now, because it seems to me that this is just a sort of take-home point. And it's to do with the famous legend of Archimedes, whereby the thirsty crow drops the stones into the jar so that the level of the water is raised up and sufficiently it slakes its thirst. And in the laboratory, you can do exactly the same set of experiments whereby they are trained, that's important, to drop lumps of rock or something, thereby retrieving the food once it floats closer enough to the beak. And at first sight, this appears to be an utterly spectacular example of animal cognition. But some scientists are too ingenious for the intelligence of the crow, and you can make these experiments more complicated by, for example, joining the tubes underneath this platform, only some of which are connected. After a great deal of training, the crow will eventually understand what is going on. But the notion that it's some sort of proto-Archimedes is, as we say, for the birds. Crucially, in this, and I think all other cases, it is clear that animals have no grasp at all of cause and effect. They cannot join the dots, and correspondingly, they have no concept at all of rationality. And as again alluded to in the previous talk, that is something which is integral to us, both as scientists and you, in certain cases, as theologians. And as I mentioned, training, another aspect which is always reported in the papers, but always in the small print, is the amount of training you have to do for these animals is typically absolutely exhaustive. In certain cases, one may have up to 50,000 trials before the animal eventually cottons on as to what you want it to do. And this, again, is not a criticism of the animal. It is simply that they themselves do not understand what you want of them unless you effectively turn them into circus tricks. Other aspects which at first sight seem to be compellingly similar to the humans, and this too, of course, ultimately goes into theology, is the use and making of tools. Indeed, there are some striking examples. But when you consider something astonishing like, as no doubt you're familiar with this bronze astronomical device recovered from the Aegean, probably dating from around 100 AD, based on a Ptolemaic system, is that in striking contrast to any animal tool, human tools make tools to make other tools. In other words, we have the potential for a cumulative culture. In contrast, for all intents and purposes, no animal uses one tool to make another tool. And if they cannot do that, then they will never have a technology. And that too is something which we live and swim with. It is integral to us being human. Now, this may come as a bit of surprise, but no animals teach. Animals certainly learn, but they do not actually instruct their young in the sense that they can actually enter the mind of the pupil and understand whether it is gaining in understanding or still lacking levels of comprehension. Again, I could give you many such examples. The one, for instance, of chimpanzees, where the mother uses a large rock to break open a nut. The young sitting beside it will, after exhaustive observation going on for roughly 3 years, eventually cotton on as to what is happening. Again, this is not an insult to the animal. It is simply that the animal does not have a theory of mind. It cannot enter into the mind of the other individual beside it. So correspondingly, no animal can ever be an actor. Animals recognize themselves in mirrors, mirror self-recognition. And this too appears to be a crucial part of being human-like. In other words, the idea that somehow the thing in the reflective surface is me, myself, the personality. Well, again, it turns out that this so-called mirror self-recognition is indeed present in a number of animals, although it's rather scattered. But crucially, for all intents and purposes, this capacity is restricted to those animals which live in the company of humans. It's what we call enculturation. So in those particular cases, animals which are brought up in human company are markedly smarter and more cognitively developed than their friends in the wild. But in the wild, you'll never see a chimpanzee looking into a pool of water and say, "No, I'm a handsome child, rather good, better shaped," you know, sort of thing. I don't know. This is something which tells us actually something about also almost the point about Genesis, about the point between relationship of ourselves and other animals. So I hope again to persuade you, as more theologically informed than I am, where there may be areas of some discourse. The thing I only learnt the other day is that animals never say farewell. They never say goodbye. They may greet each other effusively. And I think the reason for this is, for all intents and purposes, animals have no sense of the future. And once again, if you don't understand the future, there's no possibility of ever having an eschatology. And it's when we then move into the areas which even humans find demanding, but the abstract certainties, for example, of mathematics, and many of you will be familiar with this famous quote from Gene Wigner in Princeton in 1960 about the inappropriateness, so to speak, of mathematics, how utterly remarkable it is. So it is that in a case which I'm not well equipped to explain to you because I'm almost innumerate, but the idea, for instance, of a complex number, which Wigner mentions in his article, is something which is completely abstract. It has no other existence. It may exist on a piece of paper. But so I'm told, once you invent these concepts, as Dirac did famously in a different context, then they achieve enormous traction. And I won't dwell on this in any length, but although some people might try and persuade you that if there's one thing we do share in common, it's actually music. In point of fact, human music is really utterly, utterly different from such things as birdsong and the like. And then what about language? Because after all, the notion has been for many years that such examples as, can I get this thing to work? Such examples of the vervet monkey, which have three calls. They have one for snake, one for leopard, and one for the eagle. And you see in this particular case, it hasn't worked too well, has it? And the notion has been that these calls are somehow proto-words. Well, it would take too long, again, to unpack this in any detail, but I hope I could persuade you that in point of fact, the idea that this is anything akin to a language in terms of transmitting meaning, in terms of having any sense of recursion, in having any sense whereby one can transfer the meaning of word to an apparently completely new dimension and still make yourself comprehensible, is once again something which is entirely beyond any animal itself. They certainly vocalize, but they do not talk. Oops, sorry, go back one. So, to try and conclude as quickly as I can, all of this, especially language, has automatic theological implications. Again, was mentioned in passing in the last talk, I think, about the word and the opening of John's Gospel. And it thereby also extends to the general problem of consciousness. Now, this is a graveyard of ambition. I have my own sort of semi-private hunches about it. But in this particular area, I'm immensely influenced by the co-inkling of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. This is Owen Barfield. And I think what I've written up there is almost certainly beyond legibility. But if you're not familiar with Barfield's thinking, then I recommend him very highly, because very briefly, he has an extraordinarily novel take on both the origins of language and also the fact that almost certainly in human history, our own consciousness has evolved and changed. And some of you might even hear a small echo of Teilhard there as well. But in any event, the idea that this language came merely from the grunts and hoots of animals is, in Barfield's view, entirely wrong. And the sense of language is, first of all, it is deeply mythopoeic. And second of all, and this has been echoed in science, words which once had effectively a comprehensive metaphysical meaning have been increasingly broken up. So technical precision has been arrived at, but at the expense of a mythical view of the world. And this has been to our huge advantage in terms of human comfort and safety, but has been to our massive disadvantage in our alienation from the rest of the universe. Barfield is ultimately optimistic in this area, but I find his way of looking at things very instructive. Oops, come on, you twit. Oh, da, da, da. And it's absolutely no accident at all that Barfield was enormously influential on Tolkien Now, Tolkien was a Catholic, as you know. Generally speaking, if I talk to an audience of materialists, as a deep groan goes up. Oh, that fantasy writer, tut, 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 tut. Well, I have even less time to extol the virtues of Tolkien, but he was a most unusual individual and had a series of totally remarkable insights. And there's a famous story towards the end of his life where somebody accosted him in the street and said, well, I believe I paraphrase, well, Mr. Tolkien, you don't actually think you invented those worlds, do you? Well, discuss. So the point, come on, twit. There we are. The other aspect about this, which again I think bears directly on the previous talk, is the notion of the Tower of Babel. Now, we had an introduction to Genesis, as you'll know much better than I will, some chapters on. We have something which, to the first approximation, has been almost transferred, I believe, into a folk story as to the origins of language. In other words, one has this enormous tower, and God disapproves of this. The peoples are scattered all over the place. And as a consequence, they end up with dialects and different languages and can't understand each other. It's all a matter of a sort of a rabble of voices. Well, the apocryphal areas, especially the book of Jasher, and I think also Joseph, if I understand correctly, is that this is a highly incomplete view of what this construction was all about. It was effectively an assault on heaven. It was an attempt by humans to take heaven over. And of course, you'll know in technocracies, that is precisely what people propose to do. And in the book of Jasher in particular, there are gripping descriptions of archers standing at the top of this immense construction and shooting arrows up into the clouds, and the arrows falling back, covered with the blood of angels or possibly even God himself. So the overthrow of the Tower of Babel is something which goes far, far beyond a set of folklore stories about origins of language. And this has a set of consequences which we are living with today. Come on. Some years ago, I came across this book. Some of you may have know of it, by Paul Oppenheimer, called Evil and Demonic. And it's largely dealing with 20th century films, as it so happens, of which I am no expert at all. But it has a fascinating set of paragraphs on this very question of the Tower of Babel and the like. And it leads on to the thing which, again, was alluded to in the previous talk, is the nature of what you're allowed to say and what you're allowed to say with regard to free speech. In my country, in the States, and I hope you are not experiencing this as seriously in Poland, things have got to an absolutely critical stage. It's totally ridiculous. You're not allowed to say all sorts of things. And here's one of my other heroes, Churchill, and I hope you think well of him as well. And the idea here is that one can't say certain things because somebody might be offended, seems to me absolutely ludicrous. And people have been taking up the sort of banner to try and roll back this thing. I just showed John Cleese here with his department of silly walks and so forth. But he's been particularly outspoken, as several other people have been, as to the importance to being able to say exactly what you like, however much it might offend somebody else. And this, again, is something which I think, and this is a dangerous thing to mention to a largely Catholic audience, also for an evolutionary biologist even to suggest, but my sense is, going back to this famous quote from Ephesians by Paul, is that there's something almost demonic in what's going on at the moment. Every time you think you're turning the tide slightly back, it rushes forward and overwhelms another group of people. Now, one can get quite carried away with this, and one can be given over to conspiracy theories, but one does wonder where some of the impetus for these malign forces are actually coming from. And one can see this in literature, and this is why I think Lear, as Paul Oppenheimer also insists in his book, is so exceptionally powerful. Because in Lear, even though I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, as I understand it, the world spirals into catastrophe, the world is drained of meaning. It is all completely senseless and pointless. It might be due to Lear's stupidity with his three daughters, but the net result is a scene of complete and utter catastrophe. And one can go to other Shakespeare plays, Macbeth in particular, which have something of a similar thing. But Lear, I think, is the most powerful of his plays, even excluding, believe it or not, The Tempest. And others of you may be familiar with C.S. Lewis's trilogy of science fiction, of which the third is That Hideous Strength. And here too, if you have read the book, then you'll remember the banquet at the end in Belbury, whereby that hideous strength, which is what the shadow of Babel actually throws across this Institute of Scientific Excellence, then unhinges the complete company so that they literally become animals again. And this set of passages whereby these people become literally bestial offends much modern sensibility. It couldn't possibly happen to us, could it? Well, perhaps even in this country, there are some memories of something which was not completely dissimilar as was imposed on you by the Nazis. Well, is all lost? No, far from it. I'm actually quite optimistic. I think, in fact, the potentials for transcendence, the potentials for moving beyond ourselves are almost unlimited. There is a great deal to play for. And this is another personal interest, and some of you almost certainly have experience of this yourselves. You're not at liberty to come up and tell me if you don't want to. But many of us have had on occasion times when we have, or opportunities when we have literally stood out of time and space. We have actually gone into different dimensions. And arguably, in point of fact, mathematics is an analogue of that. Some of you may know the author in Rice University, Jeff Kripal. He's written prolifically on this area, but Authors of the Impossible is an investigation of what he calls the paranormal and the sacred. I'm not going to unpack the various chapters he addresses here. I'm just going to end with two stories, well, not too much, two stories. But even though I'm a scientist, by no stretch of the imagination am I a materialist. I can't actually understand how you could be one, come to think about it. But in my own limited experience, though in a rather minor way, and certainly from reading quite widely in this area, and some of you who are priests will almost certainly know more about this and is probably wise, there are extraordinary things which can happen. And I'll just tell you two stories. Well, hardly two stories. First of all, there is this account of Joseph Coppertino, the famous flying monk in Italy. How absolutely ridiculous, ludicrous. People don't fly. Well, all one can say is that if he didn't fly, there were a very large number of deluded people who saw him. And it is possible for human delusion to be almost infinite, as Einstein reminded us. But it seems to me that this historical account seems to be reasonable. He did. If you don't want to believe it, it doesn't matter. Nothing much hangs on it. But if he did, then something is rather different. And then the second story is to do with this man here. This is John O'Connor, and he is the prototype of Father Brown in the G.K. Chesterton detective stories. And in his book, The Real Father Brown, and Chesterton and Brown were great friends, Chesterton and O'Connor were great friends. O'Connor was summoned up to a lunatic asylum. This is before the Second World War, and in those days, it was literally a padded cell, which was designed to restrain the prisoner from much self-injury. There would be some illumination high up in the wall. He was called up there on a Sunday morning, and the prison warders in this lunatic asylum said, "We'd like to see what you make of this, sir." A lunatic had been admitted the previous evening, completely uncontrollable and mad. He was put in the padded cell. When they looked up that morning afterwards, the window was broken. There were some footprints on the outside. It was far beyond the reach of anybody, but that room was empty. The man had vanished. Now, once again, this is an impossible story. You're not expected to believe in. And I think also, when you look at the picture of Father O'Connor, he looks a pretty shifty and dishonest character, doesn't he? You know, I wouldn't trust him as far as you could throw him. But he simply says in his book, this is true. It happened. And I, again, would take O'Connor's word for it versus that of a skeptic. So I've gone on, hopefully not too long. I hope I provoked you beyond all reasonable levels. I apologise that you have to listen to English as mostly a relatively unfamiliar language. But I just thought I'd finish, as again I mentioned very briefly, with my favourite aircraft, the Spitfire. I was actually lucky enough, my wife, bless her, we have a couple of Spitfires, and you can go for a ride for one in Duxford Airport near Cambridge. So if you've got quite a lot of money, you can have a ride in a Spitfire, and I highly recommend it. We've got 2 Messerschmitts and 1 Dornier, but that's another story. But again, just also to salute that the turning point, if anything, in the Battle of Britain was the utter determination of the pilots from this country and also from the Czech Republic, because those two really knew what was at stake. And I sometimes forget sometimes fear we forget what's at stake today. So thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. It was fantastic. You just mentioned before, maybe there are any questions, that purposely I have not introduced titles nor institutions, affiliations of the speakers, because I'm not quite sure to what extent you represent the University of Cambridge, that you are a professor at. So all this is written in the bios that you can see read at the website. And one thing that I should also mention, this morning I met Simon, I bumped to him at the breakfast, and I apologized for the rain with which we greeted you in Poland, to which you responded that you actually very much like it because it was very dry.
Yeah. I like rain in any case. I like weather.
Right. Questions, comments? All right.
Thank you.
Oh, could you please come here because of the technical reasons and introduce yourself, because we are recording it.
Oh, we're recording. Okay. Yes. So I'm Aaron Sugar. I'm a neuroscientist, and I loved your talk. It was brilliant and very engaging. I just had a question. Early in your talk, you mentioned something about cause-effect and how animals don't really have a sense of cause and effect, and that puzzled me. I wonder if maybe you were thinking of cause and effect in a different way than I do, but if there were no appreciation of cause and effect in animals, there'd be no reinforcement learning, and they would simply not survive. So I wonder if you could clarify that a bit.
Yeah. Well, to the best of my ability, what I was trying to convey, especially based on the so-called Aesop fable experiments, is that the animals themselves will, by associative learning, eventually understand what to do. But what they can't do is provide a rational explanation in advance of what they wish to do. In other words, they can't produce a model, they cannot produce a hypothesis. They have no way of articulating that, probably because they don't have language. So there's no doubt at all that in the real world, they have to learn, and they generally have to learn quite quickly. But the areas in which they mostly have to learn are, from our perspective, utterly trivial. They're ones that have not been eaten or reproducing and the like. So the crucial thing here is not the fact that they can learn and understand. I don't for a moment dispute that animals have cognition. They most likely dream. And that makes it all the more puzzling what the differences are in reality between ourselves and the animals. But what does seem to be clear is that they, as I mentioned a moment ago, so they can't actually build the hypothesis. They have no understanding, the name will come in a moment. They could never be a physicist. They couldn't understand weight. They wouldn't have an idea of gravity. I mean, an analogy. I think again it was Dan Povinelli who's written very interesting in this area. He's an animal behaviorist in your country. Is that if, for instance, a chimpanzee is carrying around a branch, it might use that branch for various sorts of things. That's perfectly reasonable, and it's got some comprehension on it. But it could never associate that branch as actually being part of a tree. So correspondingly, a crow might have a wire, which you can sometimes bend even into a hook, but you have no comprehension that that wire could also be part of a wire fence. So what they can't do is project themselves from the immediate into the infinite.
I see. So I was thinking of cause and effect just in the sense of reinforcement learning and operant learning, where if you behaved in a certain way and there was a good outcome. You want to learn to do that again. Likewise, and the opposite if it was a bad outcome. But you only want to learn that if you have a sense that I caused it. Otherwise, you don't want that that learning signal. But that's a very low level appreciation of cause and effect.
The animal cannot understand it as an agent. It has no agency, and that again is crucially different because that's why it's theologically so significant. And again. You politely said, and who is this joker from the University of Cambridge? We've got a new vice-chancellor. You could drop her a line if you like. So it's a terrible talk. Bloke in Kraków. Goodness, what's he talking about? Is that one is allowed to speak off-piste now. One can actually come to outside views on this. So I hope that answers in a way your question. I'm not demeaning the animals. What they do brilliantly. But what they do mostly isn't very interesting.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Yes, please, because so in order to be heard...
I have a very loud voice. So
Video recording.
So this is just a question based on this exchange you just had. Are you saying that animals don't sort of generalize, that they can't say, well, A causes B, well, therefore maybe A can cause other things similar to B, or something like that, that they don't, this wire could be used as a hook, but they don't say, well, maybe I could use the wire for other purposes that are similar. Is that sort of what you're saying, that they can't generalize?
Yes, it is, yes. Yeah, and so the point here, for instance, is that there was a very famous set of experiments with New Caledonian crows, and there's definitely adept tool makers. And there was one crow, unfortunately deceased, called Betty in Oxford. And there's a spectacular set of videos whereby Betty has a straight piece of wire, bends it into a hook, and by doing that can actually lower the hook into a recessed tube which has food which is otherwise out of reach. And then she pulls the food bucket up, and there's applause all round. This is totally brilliant. But in point of fact, again and again we find with this tool use, first of all, that hook making is innate to the New Caledonian crow. She's not actually joining the dots again. It's something she's got innate in her memory, in her sort of instinctive view on that. And the second point, as I briefly mentioned, possibly too quickly, is that no animal ever makes one tool to make another tool. What you can do is in the laboratory arrange a system whereby they have to use one tool to fetch another tool to do something else. But again, I find these sorts of examples actually effectively unconvincing. They're totally artificial. And most of these animals are brought up, as I mentioned, in close company with humans, and therefore are not really the best witnesses for the behavior in the wild. And of course, you've got to remember that humans and animals have been looking at each other for around 3 million years. And animals are perfectly well aware of us, mostly in a hostile way. But even so, they do observe. They're not in their own way stupid. What they can never do is make that transition, and especially to language. And that, I think, is crucial. And it's extremely puzzling. After all, they have the elements of vocalization. In birdsong, you can refer to things which might be a syntax or a semantics, but they can never export that into a new context. Whereas you think the adaptive advantage of that would be enormous. And so it is with us. Except, of course, we then learn how to lie. If we have time, there's a question there, but we may need to move on.
Come here. Introduce yourself.
Yes. I'm Bertha Moritz, I'm a biologist.
Yeah, sorry, excuse me.
I'm Bertha Moritz, I'm a biologist. I wanted to ask you, you said that animals don't have the concept of future. What about the general concept of time? Do they have that?
The question is about a concept of time and the like, and animals certainly have memories, and there's a lot of debate about this, of course, a lot of debate about everything, which in its own way is why it's such fun being a scientist. But to the first approximation, I think it is the case that animals do not have so-called episodic memory. In other words, they may well, there's a classic examples of crows, or related to crows, which conceal food for the winter. And they can remember up to 9,000 locations. And one can see in terms of a severe northern winter, this is very much a selective advantage. But one could be reasonably certain that that is simply remembering what that location was. And they wouldn't say, oh, that was Tuesday week, I put that there, or anything like that. So they have to memorize because, of course, otherwise, as was already indicated, their lives are going to be even shorter than they generally are. But the thought that actually they can construct a narrative, that they can construct a history, that they could even use anything like a metaphor for the concept of winter, is something which I think is completely beyond them. But there's absolutely no reason why they should know about these things. They do what they do very well, but they don't do anything else, whereas we do everything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.